4.1 Introduction to Learning. The objective for today is students will be able to describe the essential characteristics of learning and apply learning principles to explain behaviors. So learning is any experience that can alter or shape our behavior. There are a variety of ways that learning can happen. Some ways that learning happens almost instinctively or without us necessarily realizing it, without us putting forth any effort per se. And one way of that happening is what we call insight learning. And this is where you have a sudden understanding of a problem. So you're faced with a problem, maybe you can't figure it out, and then all of a sudden it's like, bam, I've got it. I know what this is, I know how to solve it. That would be what we call insight learning. A second type of learning is what we call latent learning. And this might be that you learned something, but you didn't realize that you learned it until later. And this is a good example of this is maybe a little kid watched mom or dad do something, or mom or dad were trying to teach them how to do something. And then they didn't do it, and then all of a sudden one day they did it. Well, it's because they had latent learning. Great example of this would be Jack the other day. He has learned how to potty train, and there have been times where we've had to been outside and he has to go to the bathroom, and so we let him go to the bathroom behind a tree. Well, then all of a sudden, today, he goes to the bathroom in the middle of our front yard. That would be an example of latent learning. We didn't know that he learned that he could pull his pants down and go to the bathroom in the front yard, but by observing and by different experiences, he had figured that out. Part of the way this happens, too, is through what we call a cognitive map. A cognitive map is your mental layout of information. So as you experience new things, you kind of set up this cognitive map in your brain of every experience you have. And you may not need that experience right now, but you'll come back to it at a later point. Social learning, the theory that we learn social behavior by observing and imitating and by being rewarded or punished. So we actually see this a lot with little kids, especially when it comes to gender roles. And as we move into a society that is more accepting of all type of gender roles, we still see this happening. We see like little girls tend to lean towards dolls, towards that like motherly or matronly, and little boys tend to lean towards cars. And there's this theory that that happens because of social learning. You learn those norms through your social interactions. Part of this is also what we call social scripts, and this is what we learn from our culture. So this just shows us that depending on what culture you're in, those social norms might be slightly different. Another type of learning is what we call emotional learning. And these are things that we've learned because the experience was tied to a strong emotion. So it's not necessarily something that you intended or meant to learn, but because the emotion that it was tied to is so strong, you ended up learning it. And the first thing we call taste aversion. Have you ever eaten something and then happened to get sick after that and then never want to eat that item again? That's taste aversion. So taste aversion is actually what we consider a biological response. It's your body's way of protecting itself so that if you eat something poisonous, you know never to eat that again. But John Garcia was the one who figured this out, and he was testing rats, and he came across this idea. And essentially what he did was he gave rats some radiation, which made them very sick. And then he paired that radiation with either food, sights, or sounds. And what he found is the only ones that really developed any sort of relationship or aversion was the ones that were paired with food. Superstitious behavior is when you when you get a reward for a behavior and it may increase the likelihood of the behavior. So a good example that I read of this, we see a lot of superstition in baseball. So batter goes up to the plate, hits his bat on the ground a couple times, and then his next at bat he hits home run. So then every time he's going to hit the bat with the base a few times before he strikes or before he tries to hit the ball, and hope that he'll get that home run again. That would be superstitious behavior. And superstitious behavior is rewarded intermittently, which can make it very hard to extinct. And the final type of emotional learning is what we know as learned helplessness. And part of this is because of learned predictability. Predictability is exactly what it sounds like. You learn to predict that something was going to happen to you. So if you know that you hear a certain sound, it may mean that you're going to get a certain punishment. So that you learn to predict that. But with her learned helplessness, what it is, it's almost the exact opposite of where they have learned that there's some sort of negative encounter or there's some sort of traumatic event. And so because of that, they lose sight of control, they feel helpless, and they learn to almost withdraw at times. Biological constraints. I loved this quote. I thought this quote was so perfect. Never try to teach a pig to sing. It wastes your time and annoys the pig. Essentially what this is saying is that you can only teach people so much. There's some sort of biological constraint on what you can and cannot learn or be taught. You could spend all day, all night for days on end with a pig and you're still not going to be able to get them to sing. It will never happen. Because of the fact that biological constraints predispose organisms to learn associations that are naturally adaptive. What does that mean? We learn to associate things, or we learn to pair things together that are natural or come natural to us. For example, you can teach a hamster to dig a hole in the ground while looking for food because hamsters do that. But you cannot teach a hamster to wash its face because hamsters don't wash their faces. So there is a little bit of a biological constraint to all learning. The instinctive drift is a tendency of learning behavior to gradually revert biologically to predisposition patterns. So essentially what they're saying here is that you can teach an animal something new, and they might be really good at it for a couple of years. But then eventually this instinctive drift is going to come back in and kind of put them back into their natural habitats, at least mentally. And that's it for today.